about the early European Commission.
Yeah, well, that was not even an identity study per se. I mean, that's what we made it into. The initial question was in 2001, in the summer, prior to the 9/11 attacks. It was in May, June, July. I think there was a final presentation, I think even in the last week of August or first week of September that year. But the question there was simply a group of intellectuals had been gathered to discuss Brussels. And they were doing that because Brussels had been granted officially the state of capital of the European Union. It had, and for 40 years it in a way de facto was, but now as a kind of gift, as part of the Nice Treaty, I believe it had been made official. And on that occasion, a group of intellectuals had been gathered to discuss the symbolic needs of a capital that wasn't the capital of a country, but that was the capital of a trans-political European system, which would make it notably different from Berlin, Paris, or London. And what exactly was a capital that didn't have a country to back it? So I guess they more or less expected some sort of urban study, given the fact that we're architects, on symbols, maybe even physical symbols in Brussels, monumental notions, God knows what, but I'm sure they expected something a lot closer to home in terms of our professional expertise. But we started digging, and in a way, it's very difficult to discuss symbols if you don't know what they symbolize. And when you start digging long enough, Europe as a political system had spent a lot of time on bureaucracy, a lot of time on laws, with at the time particularly astonishing achievements, but had never spent any energy communicating their goals directly. I mean, they had gained importance largely by stealth, but they were so important by then, they were about to expand also to 24 members, including the former, that in a way, a process where they grew by stealth couldn't really work anymore. They were simply already too visible, they were discussed too much that they couldn't rely on a kind of hush-hush approach of discretion, and that something very immediate needed to happen to communicate their goals. So we identified, in talking about Brussels, we identified what we called, I believe, the iconographic deficit of Europe. We always love these catchphrases because they mobilize enthusiasm on the one hand, but on the other hand, they also set a kind of an agenda where we can pursue with our traditional instruments, our knowledge, our expertise, our skills, a goal that is slightly beyond those skills. So in that sense, that phrase worked perfectly. So that's what we did. We explored the iconographic deficit. From that resulted, as you probably know, the passport and first of all, the flag. Mm. And the flag wasn't a flag. The flag was part of a series of graphic experiments we did. Europe had an abundance of language, because you presumably also know this photograph of the acquis communautaire. It's been in the exhibition. It's a book of 90,000 pages, 6.5 meters long, I think about a couple of 100 kilos. We made a print of the sum total of all European laws that only exist as virtual documents on a computer. Nobody had ever done that, and then we found out that once you did that, you had a book that was actually far longer than it was wide, etc. It was an element in a display, but it just simply showed a weird irony. On the one hand, an enormous admiration for the serious labor, but on the a desire to be transparent, but on the other hand, a complete impenetrability that resulted from Europe's desire to be transparent. So in that sense, momentarily we skipped language, and focused on kind of graphic symbols in a way, as where it had an abundance of language, a number of visual symbols that would be so immediate they would make it clear at a glance. The whole notion was diversity. And of course, diversity is something you can talk very long about, but this is a symbol where every flag of Europe is abstracted in a little barcode, and then they're amalgamated. So this is a section from Europe running from west to east. Greece was still the last to join. Well, I won't. Let's not go into that. But so it's in a way a very potent symbol that in a way expresses the colorfulness, cheerfulness, diversity of Europe in a very immediate and probably canvassing way. We made a whole series of those as symbols, as graphic experiments. I think in reporting on the outcome of that commission, particularly the British press literally took this as a flag and has propelled the myth into the world that this was a flag, because then of course, I believe it was the Independent first said, goodbye stars, hello stripes, one flag, and then the Sun reacted to the Independent, the Guardian reacted to the Sun. There were even competitions launched, I believe. The Sun had a thing like, this is not a flag, this is a deck chair. And then the Guardian launched a competition under the title New European Flag, comma, can you do better, question mark. So it was, for us, a very interesting thing that a notional experiment, a notional thought exercise could hit a kind of pent-up nerve and warrant and create an amount of meat. I think our office simply couldn't work for a week. From phone calls, from radio, television, etc., everybody that came in simply took this myth from the British press as a complete druid, and just kept asking. So in a way, what had been quite a discrete thought experiment spiraled into, and even follow-up commissions later from the Dutch presidency to do a large exhibition in the name. So those were the early days, and that's when we discovered also that what we saw as a relatively marginal side note, a little bit of extra that we could offer beyond other architects' practices, could actually, in terms of attention, it was maybe 5% of your work creating 95% of the media attention for a week, and that indicated something that was also very formative in the whole notion of AMO.
So the idea of the other architect is to really focus on a kind of like research aspect or intellectual part that architects always have in their practice, but someone has also, pushed more forward as a strong component. And we are really interested in this idea of, OMA and AMO, and how, even this idea of creating a separate entity inside the office can sort of like put forward this idea of a research agenda, or even the idea that the focus of your project are from the beginning the fact that the final product is not a built product. So the idea that from the beginning even you accept the idea that is still an architectural thinking, but is not applied to something that is built. And so we're very much interested also in this idea of like why really also somehow also separating the two and have a very clear I'd say intention of the two identity. I know that there is, and we are curious to understand also how the two works together. So I think one of the first questions was for us is like how AMO and why started, and I know that this is connected to the story of Universal.
Well, there is the story of how it started, and there is the reason why it came about. It was at the end of the 90s. We had a situation in the office where there were 3 simultaneous commissions. One was a commission to design and build the headquarters of Universal Studios. The other commission was a commission given by Schiphol, the Netherlands airport, the Amsterdam airport, to relocate it to an island in the North Sea, a massive infrastructural effort. And then at the time we were also approached by Prada. Now, the interesting thing is that two of those commissions fundamentally never led to anything. The Universal headquarters as a commission was cancelled. Amsterdam Airport did not relocate to the North Sea, but stayed where it was. And in any traditional life of an architect, you would have simply set that aside, you would have moved on, and largely, probably internally, regarded them as aborted attempts or as failures. But the third commission, the Prada Commission, shed a very interesting light on the supposed failure of those two other commissions, in the sense that Prada came to us with a question that was way broader than just to do their stores. They wanted to reinvent themselves. They, I think there was a sort of incursion into America and Asia of their stores. So we'd been asked to, I think, look at 3 stores in the beginning: San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York. New York and Los Angeles have been built. But those stores were only part of the manifestations of a deeper idea that had to do with their brand identity, that had to do with a particular strategy. So rather than a client commissioning us a building or a store, they became a partner, where there was really almost like a kind of method acting. It's another creative organization, and we're a creative organization, where through a kind of extreme mutual identification, we in a way became co-thinkers of many of the things they did. We're still working for them. We still, of course, the Fondation de Prada has been completed very recently, but we still do fashion shows for them. We do all sorts of things for them. We, I think, even for a short time, co-thought about their IPO. We looked at their websites, all sorts of things. There was an enormous package of deliverables, sometimes physical, sometimes virtual, but it was all the manifestation of something deeper, of a new way of working. And in that sense, that way of working also led us to reinterpret both Universal and Schiphol as experiences rather than as failed attempts at realizing something physical. And it is, and that's in a way the more a question, answer to the question why. It is very interesting how traditionally architecture applies knowledge. You obtain knowledge, and then you apply it in practice, or at least you hope you can apply the larger part of it. But practice itself almost never becomes a form of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And that is also, in a way, exacerbated in the whole economy of architecture, where learning is not paid, and all the economic rewards go to practice, go actually once you realize something. Whereas, of course, knowledge in a lot of other domains is simply a paid activity. Of course, this was the 90s. This was the end of an era of globalization. It was a context of more and more privatization in the world, a shrinking public sector, less and less traditional sponsors for thinking and the obtaining of knowledge. And so therefore we looked more and more to a particular type of commissions, paid commissions, that could in a way foster the broadening of knowledge, which we had always done. I mean, there was of course AMO before there was AMO, in the sense that many of our competitions, many of our buildings, they had an immense amount of thought, they had an immense amount of contemplation. I hesitate the word research, but still there was always that conceptual intellectual activity that even accommodated the creation of buildings beforehand. But there was a new situation in the world where it was necessary to give it an economic dimension. And it was even necessary, you talk about the separation between thinking and doing. We've only made that separation to, in a way, realize a better complementarity in the end. I think when you do not make the separation, you get a very inextricable blur where it's never clear whether you're thinking for an ulterior motive because you want to build as an architect, or whether you're just thinking for, let's say, more objective reasons. And by separating the two, we, in a way, hope to create a more fruitful dialectic between them. And also to survive in a context where we simply we no longer make projects to have clients, but in a way we have clients to have projects or our pursuits, where in a way that ambivalence is introduced simply to stay intellectually alive in an ever more competitive context. I think in part AMO is a marketing strategy. I mean, it by definition is, for the whole of our organization, which we can refer to as OMA, AMO, but I mean for our being, since it often addressed, particularly in the beginning, it addressed branding issues, therefore it inevitably had an effect on our own branding, I think.
So how, when let's say a client comes in, is actually your decision if a person like a client as Prada will come with this like broad scope, is your decision to say, well, this is actually a
it's fairly evident, I would say. I mean, we know, although we spend a lot of time writing definitions, but it's never been rigid. But when a client comes in, asks us to do something or a number of things, it's fairly evident which is which. And I think in the case of Prada, it was clear that there was an OMA component to it and there was an AMO component to it. So that's generally fairly evident and never subject of much discussion internally. That sorts itself out.
And how, in reading, at least what has been written, for example, on the Universal project, it seems to me that actually all your the work you have done, the research, actually revealed to the company like their strength, but also their weakness. And I don't know if we can even say, that this actually brought to the fact, because there was also an economical issues and everything, to the fact that at the end, somehow, I don't say you killed yourself, the project, but somehow because that was also an economical decision that they couldn't go ahead and they merged and so on. But it's interesting also to see this book, for example, that is the last one.
Which is infinitely more conceptual than some of the...
Exactly, so after all the work became even more conceptual, even if in the meanwhile you had done a very all the design, technical drawings and so on.
Yeah, but in a way that book is also an autopsy. It's an autopsy of, and pretty much a realization in hindsight that henceforth we would apply strategically as a form of foresight. Mm-hmm. So that is in a way, and when the building would have been built, that book might have never been made in the same manner, because all the pride would have simply have been in the material, and what media is would have been there for people to see in the building. But it's I think architects have a very, very difficult relation to failure in general. Whenever you hear them, I heard 3 of them talk on the radio this weekend, all talking how they were dealing with the crisis, and there is a major crisis going on in the world, but none of them, they were never really affected. I mean, somehow the crisis had hit everybody else, but they had miraculously escaped through a form of genius. They were still building, etc., etc. And I think that's problematic. I think only once you are able to be philosophical about certain failures can you ultimately claim victories elsewhere. And I think this was a very, very productive move in the company. And this type of work that was present there afterwards, in a lot of buildings, like in the case of Seattle, which was a little later than Universal, there are similar things were done in the run-up to creating the design. So there the chronology was in a way restored.
And on an organizational level, how many people work for AMO and how many for OMA in this?
Well, AMO is as fluid as the processes it describes. So that varies from 5 at any given moment to 25 at another moment. I've had it very big. I mean, this whole floor has been occupied by AMO, sometimes this room, sometimes a desk, but it depends on the amount of work that comes in. We also collaborate a lot. Because even Schiphol, for instance, the roadmap project that I showed earlier. We were also then part of larger teams with financial specialists, technical specialists, etc., etc. So it's also a tool to instigate collaborations in a better and more instructive way than architecture is per se. But we've worked with temporary people. We've also, of course, had people who had different backgrounds than just being architects. They've all been here, but of course, to sustain a permanent, and that's a specialism that changes depending on what you're asked to do. And since what we do tends to change all the time, the collaboration with those people, even when they're on our payroll, tends to be temporary. Because, of course, for architects, we can sustain a sort of continuous volume of work. In this kind of more experimental domain, it depends on what the expertise is we need, and we invariably need it, in most cases, temporary, which is quite nice, because I think AMO in its present form, for instance, is small, but since it defines working as a kind of partnership, its whole body of alumni that have worked here in one way or another, and who can be probably mobilized very, very easily in the case of a new thing, is very immediate and very, very direct. So there is the small footprint in the office, and then there is the larger intellectual footprint in terms of ex-collaborators and former partners, you know, with whom we actually have, believe it or not, good relations.
We believe.
Yeah.
No, well, let's say that, I don't know if we relate this to EMO or to OMA, but let's say if one thing was clear with the last Biennale was clearly the huge network built in these years by the two combined groups.
Yeah, that for me was also quite an amazing thing. I mean, I only realized that I can halfway through, but normally you have the curator that does the central pavilion and the Arsenale, and then the national pavilions are, well, they have a theme, which is either out there or whatever, and then they're done by the individual countries, but that actually almost every single national pavilion was done by an ex-collaborator of ours, you know, who were given freedom within the theme, but who therefore understood the theme, also understood the theme properly, not as a label, but as a provocation. So through the collective understanding of the theme as a provocation, a kind of unexpected level of coherence ensued that you don't generally see at the Biennale. And that's, for me, that was even a revelation of actually how extensive that network is.
You said before, Reinier, that let's say the larger context where AMO started in that years is now, AMO has 15 years. It's 15 years old, we can say.
Yeah. My God, yeah.
You feel like that it was very clear, like the kind of situation, you say the 3 projects, but also the globalization, the moment where it started. You feel now is still acting on the same question, is still using a kind of like same approach or method, how?
I don't know, because I mean, in preparing for this talk, I've read some of the old prose, like theirs, and that got me thinking. I think initially the AMO even was an acronym of Architecture, Media and Organization, although we tend to deny that these days. But I mean, I think IBM means International Business Machines, but nobody knows it. So if it did mean that, it's a long time ago, and it was very geared towards the emergence of the internet at the time, of the .com thing. So we imagined it as architecture in the context of the virtual world, where, of course, we were struck, particularly in looking at the emergence of the virtual, we were struck by the immense amount of architectural metaphors which are actually relevant or present in the realm of computers and the internet. And but I don't think today that there is anything such as the virtual world. I think there is the real world, and then there's the digital. And then there is an ongoing speculation in how the digital affects the real world. That's a prevalent discussion to which nobody really has the answer. And particularly people that give the answer, almost nobody gives an honest answer. Because the people that discuss it are the people that benefit from it economically, the people that try to sell products, etc. Therefore, the whole domain, the whole discussion about the digital is extremely problematic. And there's a very interesting task for us in that realm, by the way, because we are, many people also call themselves smart architects, smart architecture, and it's a wonderfully oblivious domain that thinks that architecture has a history which is about as old as the internet. And there is an interesting thing that there is a combination of, in our thinking, of, I think, a type of recording, a type of curiosity, a type of awareness. I wouldn't say knowledge, because I mean, combined with a very long profession that has a very long tradition. And that is in a way our method. It's a combination of curiosity and being agnostic at the same time, which means that you can take very little at face value, which means that you go often into situation. I mean, when we first went into Europe, we knew precious little. And we simply drove around. We looked at the city, we talked to people, etc. And it's just, it was a very quick learning process, but precisely because we didn't know, we also had very little prejudice. So face value of things is a very key, almost like documentary makers, is a very key component of that method, I feel. I don't know if I'm explaining this at all well. Because I think in any of the things we study, whether it's planning, whether it's the smart city, whenever you look at it, a lot of these domains simply forego the simple process of registering, of going somewhere, seeing what it's like, observing the banality of the real world, and then being able to embrace it in order to bring it to a certain theoretical level. I mean, a lot of the whole oeuvre is based on essentially embracing banal subjects, drowning ourselves in them until they become fodder, let's say, for our more elevated theories. Mm-hmm. Whereas a lot of the traditional method is to simply project an elevated theories on a banal reality and refusing to see everything that doesn't comply with your theory. So I think there's a certain amount of agnosticism that is crucial to our method. That was there. I mean, I was there from the very beginning. I mean, in the beginning in a very fluid form, then from 2002 in the capacity of director, together with Marcus Schaefer, who's meanwhile set out on his own. But I've experienced it always like that. You know, I have a background as an architect, and I've always been curious. I've always had a lot of interests. Besides architecture, I always had a keen interest in writing. From very, very early on. I mean, I think Rem had a very varied career before he decided to become an architect. And in a way, that always stays with you. You know, a love for architecture, but a healthy skepsis about it, what it...
But I understand what you're saying. I would like just only to question a little bit this, even in observation, you filter observation in a certain way, inevitably. There are some, how can I say, values.
Yeah, or patterns. Yeah. That's definitely true.
You know, so a little bit, if you could elaborate more about that. For example.
Yeah, but that's quite difficult to answer, because I think once you elaborate these, that's also when it stops being a method. Very interestingly, you know, and I'd be happy to talk about it, but it's about a particular type of brain that is susceptible to quaint elements in seemingly normal conditions. And what that is, I don't know, because I think that's partially applying your character. But there is, what I've experienced, that there is something contagious about that ability. So it is something that is ingrained in a type of person in the end, but it's also something that is contagious, that people that come in, some do, some don't, acquire that same weird eye in the long run. It is quite interesting that with a number of people that you've worked with for a long time, when you prepare a talk or a discourse or a lecture or anything, that they, in browsing through all the chaos that is out there, that there is a developed eye in picking out the kind of quaint things to the point. And I think that also becomes, since through AMO we have verbalized and made explicit a lot of the thoughts and considerations that remain otherwise implicit. So even if, I mean, ultimately, if the fascination of this whole office is rooted in one guy that wrote one book from which this all happened, you know, even that in that utterly individualistic act of one man writing one book, there is something contagious that it's been able to create a fairly coherently operating machine of currently a little under 400 people. I mean, that is interesting. You know, so I think the method is somewhere between, well, the abstraction of a method, but also personal fascination and the oscillation between the two.
What are you working on now? As I think you're very much involved, for example, with also institution like Strelka now.
Well, we were. I mean, that is one of the most recent big things we did. We're also involved with trying to duplicate that formula in other places, potentially the Middle East. But Strelka was, of course, a very interesting situation where people asked us to create an educational institution and not design a building for it, but actually design a program or a curriculum for it. So, and that in combination with, let's say, fairly generous funds on the side of the Russian founders, created an envelope for, I think we had a contract for 3 years. Part of that contract was also that we would help them define an educational program, but that we would also work on our own disappearance, you know, so that we would in a way convey that knowledge so that they could run on their own without us, which is what they're currently doing in difficult circumstances, clearly, because the Russia of today is very different from the Russia of 2009 or 10 when we came. But it was a big, so it was a 3-year program where we ran studios, where we were paid to run studios, where we could elaborate every single preoccupation we had, from energy to public space, to the kind of shrinking cities in the Russian countryside. And that was very nice, because then clearly you have a private school that in a way sponsors your preoccupation, a kind of an ideal AMO. But in a way it was also a very easy time, because a lot of the hustling that we needed to do is in a way to find tidbits of clients that are to, you know, in an entrepreneurial sense, further these preoccupations every day, you know, and from month to month. It was very cushy. And I think it's also created and the Biennale was, of course, a similar long-term envelope that unites the whole thing in a kind of whole thing. And we're currently at a stage where we are looking how to mobilize the network of context harvested from both Strelka and the Biennale into a kind of a more independently operating entrepreneurial vehicle that goes from day to day to day to day. You know, something like Strelka or the Biennale comes around maybe once in a career. And it's very cushy because in a way Strelka, for all of its experimental nature, still is like Harvard. I mean, it's an educational context that pays you, where you can, you know, find an interesting subject for students to study, and when you're lucky, you are interested in that subject too. So Rem once spoke about that at Harvard, that it was an interesting vehicle where, in a way, a number of preoccupations of the office could be deepened in a way that the hurry of daily practice wouldn't allow. Strelka was in a way much the same thing, except that these preoccupations were largely about Russian issues. Nevertheless, they were long-term preoccupations of us as well. And I think it's been good, but in the wake of a success, and we've of course experienced this whenever we've had large commissions, in the wake of a huge success, there's little time to celebrate and a lot to do in terms of how you get by once that success is in.
you speak of themes or preoccupations,
Yeah.
speaking of Strelka. Did you try to, how can I say, introduce in this education a kind of research attitude?
Yeah, but I'm very
How did you
wary of the term research. I mean,
well,
it's,
say, an attitude similar to the one that you are developing for AMO.
yeah, what we try to do is in a way, and it was also not just a school for architects. I mean, Strelka is architecture, media, and design. So interestingly, that was the subtext of Strelka. And interesting, if you replace design by organization, and I mean there are some people who argue that one and the other are the same, then of course the subtext of Strelka was AMO.
Yeah.
Because exactly the acronym that we no longer use was their subtext. What we did, in a way, and the nice thing was, so you do not only have architects, so you cannot, you cannot have buildings as the subject of your studio. Very big relief. But what we did in many ways is that we used Strelka as, I mean, all education studies what they're supposed to study, and then context is a kind of byproduct, is a kind of footnote. You know, I think that's the whole disease of architectural education, is that it's very monomanic. It looks very monomanic at a particular discipline, and the context in which that discipline is practiced is at least temporarily kept out of the door, which means that most people, once they go from university into practice, the first feeling anyone experiences is a combination of disappointment and profound uselessness. Which is a very tragic situation. So Strelka was a vehicle for us to do a kind of reverse play, to invert that relationship, in a way prioritize an interest in context over an interest in deliverables, over an interest in product. Also because, I mean, Russia was in a very interesting, ambiguous state at that moment. Clearly, Russia was, and I think still is, a neck-and-neck race between forces for the good and forces for the not so good. But at the time, I think it looked, particularly Strelka was something that could help the forces for the good. Have a kind of modern, enlightened institute, one that could also, and we looked a lot at communism in the context of Russia, that could also talk about that in a slightly less uptight way, that could simply look at that as history and not necessarily trauma, and look at elements like that. So it was a very free place. I've never, there at Strelka, experienced any limit as to what we could discuss or what we could say. So it seemed a very encouraging sign. I don't know what it is now, to be honest. Maybe it still is. Maybe we're all exaggerating. But on the whole, I have experienced, of course, at the tail end of our time in Russia, there were signs on the wall of changes about to happen. Am I talking too much?
No.
Not at all. Not enough.
It's not true. I'm interested in the kind of like editorial and production of let's say overall office. I think you have very different things. You have like, you know, Rhymes books. You have the books that you actually, as you know, Alma produce, that they have sometimes a similar nature of some of the AMO books. Then you have the AMO kind of like reports as a kind of like editorial but also things as content, the work, for example, you have done with Wired as AMO. How you will navigate or for you are all kind of...
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I read that question in your email. I don't really know. I think they're all... I love the incoherence between the different books. I mean, I often love the complete absence of any standardization, at least in terms of format or protocol. I mean, they're also very different stories. I mean, Wired, we were guest editor, you know, of a magazine that exists, and we could infiltrate clearly, and we like doing that also as AMO. That you become a guest editor, but you inhabit the format of something else. We've always been our dream to be the guest editor of a Der Spiegel issue. Maybe it'll happen, or something like that, of mainstream media, where you give them a particular twist. I mean, content is an exhibition catalogue.
Yeah.
Is an exhibition catalogue on 7 years of OMA, on the OMA since SML XL, and it's interestingly OMA through the eyes of AMO. You know, where there is an aggressive juxtaposition of our projects, failed or realized, but it's primarily about the context in which they emerge. So content is another example of a kind of fairly radical prioritization of context. Then, this was sold for a European passport. Again, the infiltration of a format sold for €1 from a vending machine. That was all it costed to become European. So, I mean, they might be high in demand at the moment.
And what about the AMO magazine?
That's a dummy.
Yeah, I know that. Never.
That's a very beautiful dummy.
Yeah. What was the intention there? Because I read it was supposed to be published 3 times a year.
3 times a year. Well, we of course later entered a collaboration with Volume. I think with Columbia, Argis, and us. Because a magazine is also typically, it's very arrogant to assume that, you know, as a startup in an architectural office, you can produce a magazine this size 3 times a year. So we, in a way, learn as we go along, but Volume, in a way, became partially that. But this book is a collage, a kind of very beautiful collage of writing and parts that have been produced all over the place. And by making it into a collage, there is a certain beautiful level of unintentional coherence, or a kind of coherence you only realize once you put it together in a book. And the book isn't the product of a single mind that, you know, at length elaborates its thought. And a lot of the books have that. I like this book. I have it at home as well. I think the other remaining dummy. I think it's very beautiful. The almanacs, I don't know if you know them, that we made about the Middle East.
No.
Do we have them? Okay, are they? Yeah. They were books that we did in collaboration with Volume and a think tank in the Middle East. We had in the 2006 or 2008 Biennale, I can't remember, we had an exhibition called The Gulf, which was in a way taking the temperature of all the ongoing developments in the Persian or Arabian Gulf, from Kuwait going all the way down to Ras Al Khaimah. And that book is also a mix of our own observations, collected essays of people who have written about the Middle East, photo essays, and it has the same quality, that it's a collage with enough of a view or enough of a singular passion behind it to qualify as a book, but at the same time leave open a lot of speculative interpretation. I mean, I think all our formats, and this deliberately collage formats, are partially the product of intentions, but at the same time always an open invitation to new generations of people to collaborate with us. And I think that's where a book like this is very beautiful, because also in looking through it, you feel that. I mean, it's almost you're interested in reading it, and it almost whets your appetite to write an essay yourself that can be part of it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the beauty of the formula, is that it's clear, but at the same time open-ended enough to be an invitation for others to join.
I think you spoke already about that, but maybe this. I think there are still for me 2 questions. Like how much Oman and AMO, they kind of like work together. Let's say in certain cases, seems to me quite clear. Like if we take the Prada project, there was actually the Harvard shopping research before that I'm sure has been useful to then work for Prada, but then there is very clear what is the AMO part and what is the OMA part.
Yeah. Well, I'm not even sure that in terms of timing, to be honest, I think the shopping research at Harvard as part of Project on the City, I think it may have even preceded the visit of Prada to Rotterdam, which started it all. I mean, if you want to find that out, be my guest. But I mean, my recollection is that the shopping research was already there, and that it was already there, and that they're there again. You know, this is the life of an architect. It's a series of miraculous coincidences, coincidental occurrences, but you have to be able to recognize them. Yeah. And your legacy, I think, is defined by whether you do or whether you don't. Mm-hmm. AMO has introduced, in that sense, a certain patience. Creation is a patient search, I believe, is the quote of Corbusier. And since we are able to articulate our observations or make explicit or manifest our findings, we can go with a certain amount of work in the course of a process before we even have a building. And that is acceptable to clients. In doing that, you also train them to have a certain amount of patience, that once you have the solution, it is an informed solution and not a kind of proactive embrace of whatever solution. So I think that, I think it is actually it had an enormous impact on how the office deals with stress. Mm-hmm. With the stress that it's inevitable in any architect's practice. And clearly we have a lot of stress. I mean, we have a very active way of living stress, you know, with heated discussions and sometimes aggressive exchanges are part of the course. But there is definitely a mentality that there is no shame in not having a project, but that there is shame in not having pursued every intellectual alley possible to arrive at something. And in that sense, it's almost a very 60s thing that, in a way, process acquires an equal status to product, you know, which has gone out of fashion, I think, since the 1970s. It somehow had a weird second life in the course of what we do.
So which are the projects that you'd like to do for AMO now?
I would like to do, I'm really, really, really desperate to do a project on the smart city, which will be a project on the same way that this, in a way, was a statement in I like mainstream, and I particularly like projects that can topple mainstream, or that can create a take on mainstream that makes mainstream no longer mainstream. And in a way, this was produced in the context of a worldwide sustainability debate, and it sort of launched a number of Buckminster Fuller-like grandiose ideas in that context. I would like to do something very, very similar on the notion of the smart city, or on mobility. I mean, with the whole refugee crisis, all the debates about mobility seem hopelessly decadent, to me anyway. But largely, look at what everybody is talking about, and then talk about it in a very different way. I mean, I've always liked the combination of the mainstream and the marginal. I wanted to say one thing earlier, and that is not necessarily about AMO. What always struck me here, and it's the way I start most of my lectures these days, is that I've had a number of employers. And I mean, I simply started as an employee, and over the time, you know, worked my way ahead. But I've worked for a number of other Dutch and English offices. And they were always either English or they were Dutch. In our Dutch office, we spoke Dutch. That was the prevailing language. We had a typical cultural left-leaning consensus, you know, politically correct left-leaning consensus about simply every single subject in the news. And here I came, and first of all, the language wasn't Dutch. And then the next thing was that the Dutch were a minority, even in the main office in Rotterdam. And in the absence, and even with the Dutch being a minority, there was no other majority. In fact, there were only minorities. The lingua franca was a kind of pidgin English across the board, but that for me created a wonderful sense of freedom, in the sense that there were no ideological or intellectual a prioris overriding the whole thing, but a kind of interrogation became the prime method of the whole thing, where there was so much doubt and all the related inefficiency that comes with it, by the way, that in the end ensured that only the most robust ideas survive, and that therefore many of the ideas, even if they do have an intellectual dimension, I do find many of the ideas of our office very direct. You know, and on the good projects, you can always read the first paragraph of the introduction and it's clear. You may agree, you may disagree, but what it's trying to say is perfectly clear. And that is not something that exists like that. That is the product of a kind of permanent Socratian conversation. Well, really? You know, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of dumb talk before anything intelligent emerges. But I think it's and I've always experienced that as a wonderful source of freedom in the office. One that maybe it exists elsewhere. I don't know, but I had never experienced it to the same level. And I think this notion of only minorities is in a way also the idea of Europe. I mean, I think even in.
It's my second. Sorry.
And in that sense, and in that sense, I think there is even a latent political message in the seemingly accidental composition of our office, that this is also about, you know, a larger whole composed out of only minorities, which gives you a fresh start and etc.